All right, so today we are looking at Sasanka Perera's Spirit Possession and Avenging Ghosts, Stories of Supernatural Activity as Narratives of Terror and Mechanisms of Coping and Remembering. He sets the stage for his essay by noting the culture of terror that took hold of Sri Lanka in the late 1980s generated these sort of alterations in language, like the resignification of some words in a way. So what I want to point out is that I think he does something analogous with popular religious rituals and practices, noting how under conditions of terror, these things that already existed took on these kind of novel social roles within the scope of terror. And he further points out then that both insurgency and counterinsurgency aimed to physically and psychologically terrorize the population in order to exert total control over it. His analysis of ghost and possession stories follow a consistent pattern, a pattern that as a reader I find quite enabling, so I appreciated it. So provide the narrative, identify its connection to a community, and then interpret the narrative with respect to its function in that community. A story then doesn't just stand on its own as freestanding thing, but rather it exists in virtue of the function that it plays within a given community. His starting premise is that even though the wave of violence that started in 1998 came to an abrupt end in 1991, both the state apparatus that generated terror and the effects of this nearly 3 years of pervasive terror on the populace endured long after the cessation of physical violence. So it developed a kind of momentum of its own that carried beyond the period of violence itself. And so with this in mind, he sets out to do two things. First, he sets out to, quote, describe and place in perspective the appearance of certain narratives that describe two different categories of supernatural experiences, ghost stories and narratives of spirit possession. So then the ghost stories involve people killed during the terror, while narratives of spirit possession came from people who directly or indirectly experienced and survived terror. Second, Perera tries, quote, to understand the role these and other aspects of traditional spirit religion and ritual play in the context of post-terror, in the context, I should say, of post-terror Sri Lanka. So he's particularly interested in how they function as mnemonic meaning aiding the memory, as mnemonic and coping mechanisms in the wake of traumatic violence, especially when secular systems of justice and healing have been badly degraded. He explains then how violence altered people's sense of time or the proximity of events in time. This is a theme that we've encountered in the context of violence in other places as well, in that they narratively placed fairly recent events in the remote past. So as a way of creating sort of a buffer or a distance that would allow these experiences that had been intolerable to be somehow manageable. The experience of terror, however, persisted, even while the experience of justice remained elusive, at least within the worldly system, the worldly legal system, the temporal legal system. Now, we might here notice some similarities and differences with Ross's work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. For example, how people employed narrative forms in an effort, not always accomplished, to respond to past violence in official and unofficial settings, in the context of ongoing threats of violence, and in the process of transition to a new era. Perera's leading assertion here is that popular religion functions as a coping mechanism in what he calls societies of terror. In some cases, it plays a role facilitating violence. So, to take an example I'm more familiar with, in Thailand, soldiers or sometimes gangsters, people who had some expectation to encounter violence would get elaborate tattoos that were in principle designed to protect them from things like knives and bullets. This is not what Perera finds in Sri Lanka. There, these sorts of things appear in the aftermath of violence as a way of coping with violence rather than a way of anticipating violence. He says, Sri Lankan spirit mediums played and continue to play a significant role in addressing questions as to what happened to the disappeared and suggested ritual measures for assuring their safe return or of making their afterlife more comfortable. Their influence, I would argue, is more pronounced in the overall structure of coping and possible healing, end quote. Spirit mediums, I should say, and similar spiritual healers play an important cleansing role in two interrelated ways. So on the level of the individual, of course, where there might be feelings of guilt, either at having survived where others didn't or having committed violence, though that's not really something he talks about in this paper. But then also at the level of the community. So there's this sense of cleansing spaces marked by violent death in order to make them more suitable for human habitation. Again, this notion of making a space of death or devastation habitable, again, should sound an echo of Das's reflections on Wittgenstein and Cavell, with her writing about the scene of destruction and the work required to make it habitable again. The idea being then that there's not some other place that one can depart to start over, but rather that one is left in the scene of devastation, the scene of destruction, the scene of violence, with the work ahead of one in one's community to figure out how, if it's possible, to make it habitable again. So in the Sri Lankan cases that Perera studies, this work of cleansing responds through ritual expert cleansing, like say with a Buddhist monk, to beliefs that the spirits of innocents who died remain disturbed because of the unnatural nature of their deaths. In societies of terror, stories of ghosts and possession, that is, particular employments of popular religion, can be expressions of doubt about the community, uncertainty about the community, say in the sense that a social space is haunted by victims of violence that occurred there, making that space feel tenuous, unstable, pregnant with danger. But, and this is where he places his energy, they can also serve as coping mechanisms, these stories of ghosts and possession. When, for example, terror imposes silence on survivors, these sorts of narratives can act as alternative modes of expression and coping. Widespread terror, he says, creates a shadow of death. The shadow of death is akin to a dark place in a path any individual may have to go through at some point in time in a society of terror, a space that, once one has entered, one may or may not exit. Thus, the shadow of death has an element of uncertainty. Clearly, its outcome or persistence is the source of that uncertainty, an uncertainty that realizes the existential predicament of masses in societies under terror. The effect of the shadow of death, as Perera has already suggested, lives beyond the shadow itself, in the talk and torment of those who survive. So then the agents of terror need some people to survive, so that the shadow of death can have this kind of contagious effect spreading beyond those who were directly subjected to it. But it needs those people who were directly subjected to it, some of them anyway, to survive, to produce that kind of spread. Now, you could say that this strategy works in that the shadow of death transforms those who fall into it and those who come into contact with those who fall into it to spread terror more broadly. But he points out that very frequently what happens in these spaces of the shadow of death is that if a population has been exposed to it over a long period, it may have the effect of breeding resistance to it. And that he thinks of this as kind of a natural cycle that we see over and over. In Sri Lanka, he points out things are different in that the agents of terror brought a halt to violence before it could enter that stage where there was this broad popular resistance to terror. So then this period of terror in Sri Lanka shattered norms and cultural paradigms governing ideas of good or natural death among Sinhalas. Sinhalas being the largest group in Sri Lanka and also predominantly Buddhist. So then a sense of surreality attached to violent deaths, distorting social symbolism connected with religion and death, the, as it were, good or natural deaths. This sense of surrealism, though, can also be a coping mechanism, he says. As victims or larger groups attempt to construct and cling to an alternate reality, however illusory or however steeped in denial that alternate reality may be, this very surreal quality gives them some kind of resource to produce an alternate story of reality, one that will allow them to avoid or in some way respond to the brutality of the reality that they're living in. Perera suggests we understand narratives of ghost experience in the context of a language of incompleteness, suddenness, darkness, and endless unfulfilled continuity. So then something like the shock of losing a loved one that one can't get out of, that persists over time. This is especially in cases that violate cultural norms governing good death, that in those above all, death resists narration. He says, in such cases, survivors cannot easily resort to conventional means of mourning and expressions of grief. In keeping then with the theme of surreality, the appearance of bodies where they should not be, or the absence of people from places where they should be, where they're expected, that is, in the case of disappearances, forced upon people the need to believe in something other than the brutality before them, and therefore to construct these alternate realities, to clutch at the thinnest evidence to persuade them that something, say a fragment of cloth that you recognize as the kind of thing that a loved one would have worn, that's discovered in a mass grave, that something proves that this is the body of a disappeared loved one, or that some symbolic indicator, say through something gleaned through a spirit medium, shows that the loved one is still alive. So the production of some kind of a story that one can either cling to provide hope, or that one can cling to in order to offer a sense of closure. Now, this has come up in previous readings. We can compare this to the notion of the uncanny that also has cropped up in other contexts of violence, in that the survivors just can't find a conventional way to assimilate what is happening around them. And so their response to these uncanny circumstances, to feeling not at home in familiar settings, is to produce these narratives that provide an alternate reality. So, symbolic fictions of death might allow a reality that has stalled for the living, a reality stalled by the disappearance of loved ones for the living. It might allow that reality to restart again. In general, Perera writes, the construction of ghost stories and the experience of possession as a narrative of terror and unnatural and violent death have to be placed in a context where the normal processes of mourning, as well as law and order, have completely failed. While there are many types of ghosts in Sinhalese Buddhism, the relevant ones here are unhappy ghosts of people who died unnatural deaths. These are the ghosts that figure in ghost stories associated with terror. The ghost stories that concern Perera have specific narrative features. Excuse me. They may be specific to an incident or specific to an area, or both. Some are general narratives about a period of general turmoil. Most combine interrelated narrative components, producing a primary narrative about the supernatural activity and a secondary narrative of the socio-political or personal context of the primary narrative. So he gives several examples of these. In the first example, two brothers were killed and their mother loudly lamented their deaths, cursing the soldiers who she took to be responsible. And she did this for days on end until eventually military personnel killed her too. Now later, people in the community reported seeing the woman dressed all in white, weeping as she walked along the street at night, saying she was going to see her sons, and then disappearing. So that's your first narrative. Perera interprets this story and others according to its function, to construct a continual set of experiences parallel to the traumatic experiences of the immediate past. A second story follows the same kind of pattern. So an unidentified group murder a woman, and her mother becomes convinced that she's haunting their home. So she died a terrible death, and as a result of that was reborn as a low life form, the kind of thing that would haunt the house. To the mother's dismay, though, she's too poor to afford the almsgiving that would earn her merit that she could then transfer to her daughter to make her, to alleviate her negative karma and therefore allow her to stop being the kind of being who would haunt a place. What the story shows, according to Perera, is the function of Buddhist rituals in healing bereaved people. Ideally like the mother, though in this case she couldn't because she lacked the wealth for almsgiving and therefore merit, and therefore could not transfer the merit. So something that runs through all of the stories is that the ghost stories have certain features, but that they serve identifiable social functions, like allowing a mother to go on after the death of her, well, not death, the murder of her daughter. Perera notes that in ghost stories, ghosts frequently appear in spaces demarcated by violent deaths. The formulation is significant, he says, in that such narratives assure that spaces of violent death remain in the conscience of the community. Notably, then, after the cessation of violence, people would only return to these spaces, schools or workplaces as two examples, after a purification ritual, pirit, that would offer protection from malevolent ghosts to the people who would be in these spaces. So then, as a bit of a side note, there's something curious here in that there's a Buddhist ritual to protect Sinhala Buddhists from the ghosts of people, probably Sinhala Buddhists themselves, who were killed often by Sinhala Buddhist soldiers. So there's a peculiar circularity to that. His points, though, are on the one hand that this recasts the spirits of the dead as harmful agents and resorts to rituals either to convert the ghosts to Buddhist ethics, in which case they will no longer be malevolent, or to invoke the protection of gods who receive merit from the people who participate in the rituals, thereby earning themselves merit that they can transfer, and through that get the gods to protect them. On the other hand, the need to engage in ritual practices acknowledges for the whole community the gravity of the violence that occurred at that site. Perera emphasizes further that carrying out rituals with the idea of transferring merit to victims of violence allowed some element of collective coping and healing for the communities concerned, particularly for those who could not afford individual rituals. So if we think back to the story of the mother just a couple slides ago, who could not afford to carry out these rituals on her own, could not afford alms on her own, and therefore make merit to transfer her to her daughter. You can see the importance of these more collective rituals. She would be able to therefore benefit from the collective ritual. He follows this observation with another narrative about soldiers who on these 7 different occasions were pelted with stones, but these kind of ethereal stones that never hit them, thrown by unseen agents. And it happened at these 2 locations. One was a location where the head of a murdered man was found, and the other was at the home of that man. So 2 quick things. First, the notion of decapitation, I think, is not just gruesome in the straightforward way, but is gruesome in symbolic ways as well in Buddhism. So the reason for that I say this is the head is the most elevated or sanctified part of the body, the feet being the least sanctified. And so the idea of removing a head and leaving it on the ground is a particular kind of insult, let's say. But also, if you take examples like several centuries ago, the Burmese kingdom invaded the Siamese capital of the time, Ayutthaya, and while sacking the entire city, also decapitated all of the Buddha statues to be found in Ayutthaya. So this was to serve several symbolic functions. Part of it was just desecration, that the Buddha statues had lost their most elevated aspect. But beyond that, it meant that for those people, at least the idea would be, that it would compromise their ability to participate in the sorts of ritual practices that would bring them merit and allow them the possibility of a better incarnation the next time round. So that it was an attack not just in this life, but it was an attack in the next life for people in Ayutthaya as well. So all that to say that there's something symbolically potent in the decapitation that goes beyond, as I say, just the straightforward gruesomeness of decapitation. In any case, so so the other thing that I wanted to say about this is that I find the retelling of this story a little bit unclear because I'm not sure if this is a story reported by the soldiers or if it's a story reported by the community. He says that it is a way of the for the community to express its anger at the soldiers, so that they can invoke these ghostly stones thrown by ghostly entities. But it's just not clear to me who's telling the story, and so it's not obvious to me whether it's the community members gaining some kind of catharsis through this story, or if this is the soldiers expressing some sense perhaps of guilt or misgiving about what they're doing. It's just not clear to me. Anyway, that said, moving on. So the first point to note in this section is that spirit possession, so we've moved from ghost stories to spirit possession, is an integral part of Sinhala spirit religion. It's not something that came into existence only in the aftermath of terror. It existed before. And so it's just, it finds this novel application in the aftermath of terror. Second, it invokes a specifically Buddhist notion of spirits and a Buddhist pantheon of gods. Finally, in itself, spirit possession is just no big deal. There can be perfectly good and benevolent ways of being possessed by a spirit. The trouble arises when the spirit possessing one is a malevolent spirit. That's when it requires a response. It requires treatment, a ritual response of some kind. Now, Perera describes, just in a very, very quick sketch, the Buddhist hierarchy of beings, so that you have the Buddha at the top, the most elevated of beings, the most perfect of beings that there could be. Beneath that is the realm of gods. You can see in the image here, Buddha conversing with the gods, who you can also see are seeking to learn from the Buddha. Below that are humans. And then underneath humans is where you start to get the malevolent beings. So you can have Yaku on the one hand, whose malevolence arises from their bad karma, but then there are also beings like the Pretayo, who are dissatisfied spirits of dead relatives who harass the living, and they bring misfortune. Now, possession by malevolent spirits has among Sinhalese the status of an affliction. So they treat it as such. They treat it as an affliction and perform the appropriate rituals to address that affliction. In short, then, conventional cases of possession have conventional treatments. Perera wants to understand cases of possession in unconventional circumstances, the circumstance of terror, and to think of them then as a means of coping with terror. So an unconventional account of an unconventional possession, or at least a possession in an unconventional circumstance. We get two stories to illustrate this. In a short narrative, a woman experiences possession by her disappeared brother. First, possession requires that he be dead, right? That his spirit is no longer attached to his body. So in that respect, the possession already tells her the conclusion of his disappearance. He's not still living. He is now dead. But with the aid of a ritual expert brought on to exorcise her, the brother speaks through her, recounting his torture and his murder, so that in this way, the narrative provides the woman with a mechanism for coming to terms with the disappearance of the man. Now, Sumanapala found himself in an untenable position in his story as members of the JVP. JVP was a Marxist-Leninist People's Liberation Front. So they knew that he had a kiosk and in town, and they would give him posters and pressure him to put up these posters near his kiosk. They were an armed militant group, so he felt coerced to do this. He couldn't say no. Each day, in turn, the police would come and tear them down. Later, members of the JVP would come back with a new stack for him, and that evening he would put them up, and the cycle would continue. The outcome of this is that the police began to suspect him as a collaborator with the JVP. At the height of the counterinsurgency, he thought that he couldn't stay at home anymore. It was too dangerous. He could be found there, and he could suffer reprisals. So he took to sleeping away from home. On one particular night, he was away. His eldest daughter just happened to be sleeping in someone else's home that night. But his remaining family was massacred in their home, and the house burnt to the ground. Over an extended period, during which he got nothing that resembled justice for the burning of his house or the murder of his family, he claimed to have been possessed by 6 deities, most of whom were manifestations of Kali. So, just in a far, far too brief one-liner, Kali is the ferocious Hindu goddess of time, death, and change. After experiencing these obstacles to getting compensation, and indeed to getting justice, he made the point that the money he would get from compensation would never be enough, would never be adequate to the loss that he and his daughter had faced. But at least it would allow them to gain merit by offering alms, which they could then transfer to their dead to do something to alleviate their suffering in their next lives. So then this inability to meet the most basic expectation of a Buddhist, earn merit to alleviate the negative karma of his dead kin, is an important part of the context of his becoming possessed. He could not perform the conventional rites, even for violent deaths, so therefore there was an unconventional outcome. Deprived of these conventional means of coping, he produced a story on the strength of a narrative provided by a different goddess, Patani, who possessed his daughter. So this is all now coming through his daughter to him. According to this narrative, the 4 members of his family had had bad karma from a previous life in which the 4 of them acted in some deleterious way. And so their deaths in this life were the outcome of that karmic inheritance, in a sense then making the victims at fault for their own deaths. In addition, though, Sumanapala reported that Patani had identified the perpetrators and indicated that she was visiting justice upon them. So she said that one had already died of an accident, suggesting then that she would take care of the rest in turn. When people have lost their faith or their trust in the secular legal system and lost hope of this worldly justice, they may then turn to divine intervention as an alternative, as we see in this case. So the narrative alternative that Sumanapala and his daughter generated around spirit possession and the meting out of supernatural justice provide them with some means of coping. Given that, in this case, the perpetrators who falsely accused him were his neighbors, the choice to let malevolent deities deal out justice was also important in the sense of maintaining the harmony of a community that would simply be impossible if he were to pursue justice on his own. Now, this is not the end of the story, though, because the spirit Patani, possessing his daughter, also reports that the first son born to him of a new marriage after he remarried in 1992 was a reincarnation of his eldest son, and that his late wife's sister bore a son who is the reincarnation of his second son. So Perera says of this, in the perception of Sumanapala and others in the village, at least some of the victims continue to be with the family, which I believe also plays a constructive role in the ultimate long-term process of rebuilding the shattered lives of this particular family. This and similar cases do not merely constitute individual efforts of coping with the consequences of political violence. Such individual efforts succeed only because there is a wider community recognition, acceptance, and legitimization of such efforts. In that sense, they are community efforts at healing and coping. Perera makes the point here that with the collapse of temporal justice, people take recourse to supernatural mechanisms other than ghosts and spirit possessions, like consulting spirit mediums to locate the disappeared, or conventional means of visiting misfortune on those they wish to punish. So in short, people drew on the whole range of popular religions, practices, and rituals in their efforts to find ways to cope in post-terror Sri Lanka. He takes Tilaka's story, which illustrates this breadth of appeal to popular religion. When the police declined to investigate the disappearance of her husband, she resorted to consulting a spirit medium. As I said earlier, sometimes people would consult spirit mediums to try and find out where the disappeared members of their families were, if they were still alive, for example. So initially, the medium assured Tilaka that her husband was still alive, but that he was suffering in a dark place. And this is evidently a common report from spirit mediums when they're consulted about missing family members, that they're suffering in a dark place. Now, because this was the result of his karma, he wouldn't be suffering, he wouldn't be in a dark place if he had good karma. She was advised to undertake a Bodhi Puja. So it's a healing ritual that occurs by obtaining blessings. Usually it's done at a Bodhi tree. In any case, so she's advised to undertake a Bodhi Puja to bless him and to ask the gods to intervene to return him. Repeated readings telling her the same thing, that sustained her hope for a while, but after about a year and a half, her hope started to weaken. And so she collaborated with kin and with neighbors to make merit to transfer to him when, at last, the medium told her that, in fact, he had died. This produced a shift in Tilaka's tactics. So that might have looked like closure, but in fact for her, it opened a new chapter. In this new chapter, she started to focus her attention on figuring out who the perpetrators were, because she didn't know, and visiting misfortune upon them, both of which she would do through supernatural means. She went then to the god, a shrine of the god Suniyam, to call on his destructive powers with the goal of obtaining this revenge. After a couple of months, during which time her daughter started to become worried about her obsession with revenge, the spirit medium told Tilaka during a consultation that he could see the 4 bodies of those who had taken and killed her husband. So then this was a cathartic moment for her. This did provide some sense of closure, but it also left her with the certainty that only gods can deliver justice, that there isn't going to be justice delivered by the secular mechanisms, say, of courts. It has to be obtained through the gods. Now, a pivotal aspect of post-terror Sri Lanka and one that helps account for the stories of ghosts and possessions, is that the ability to reinitiate process of terror remains real. What does that mean? Well, it means that because the violence came to this abrupt halt, all of the apparatuses of terror remained in place, dormant, but in place, so that they could be reactivated at any time, so that this sort of shadow of death didn't entirely dissipate, that there was still kind of a cloud of possibility lingering over Sri Lanka. For victims and survivors, this meant that the perpetrators continue to be monsters who have not had to answer for their abuses. They haven't had to pay for it, in other words. On these grounds, and quite contrary to the official claims of a return to normalcy, expectations of justice, he says, and desire for revenge will continue to exist so long as memories of terror continue to exist. For many, though, these expectations and desires remain unfulfilled. And one of the fundamental features of post-terror societies is the reality of having to live with torturers and murderers. So state mechanisms to offer redress after a period of terror do not meet the victim's expectations, or at least in this particular case. So he does contrast the kind of commission set up by the Sri Lankan state to address this period of violence with those that we've already seen in Ross's work about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So the ones in Sri Lanka, he says, were entirely unsatisfactory for people. They just did not meet the victims' needs and expectations for justice. The one, as we've seen in South Africa, worked for some people, not for everybody, but the opportunity to produce a particular kind of narrative of their suffering under apartheid did some work for some of those people. Not so, he says, in Sri Lanka. So that it's in the light of these failures of the legal system to provide justice, of normal means of mourning and coping, so conventional deaths, getting conventional means of coping, that we have to understand the emergence of ghost stories and experiences of spirit possession. The point, once more, is not that these things, ghost stories, possessions, calling on deities to visit misfortune on others or to provide protection for oneself, it's not that these only arise in the context of terror and in the failures of the state. They were already there. They were already in place. But they become the only sources of solace and the only places to channel vengeful aggression for many people, because there aren't any other avenues available to them. So he says, under conditions of terror, when secular systems of justice and law completely collapsed, people's tendency to seek divine intervention through the recitation of Waskavi and invocations to Sunyam is not only understandable, but constitutes the only realistic option still open to them. At this point near the end of the chapter, Perera turns explicitly to questions of the construction of the self during and after the shadow of death. He says, the difference in the construction of the self in normal and altered states of consciousness was most clearly marked as a variation between loss of hope versus hope, apparent manifestations of reconciliation versus strong expectation of justice and revenge, a sense of utter powerlessness versus strong sense of empowerment, and relative silence versus graphic expression. Under these circumstances, under these conditions of self-construction, where the normal sources of construction are suspended and unavailable, the alternate constructions reveal desires for revenge and justice, not just reveal, but give expression to desires of revenge and justice. In cases of possession, while ghost stories, on the other hand, point to memories that cannot be erased, as well as expectations of justice, even if the system of law is not the avenue to provide it. Now, I use the word normal advisedly here, as it can be a loaded term in functionalist analysis, suggesting that one constructs oneself in relation to norms that act upon one, encouraging conformity to what Durkheim calls social facts, social expectations. So in these ways, normal and ordinary, they just invite different kinds of analysis and different sorts of attention. Carrying on though, importantly, even as they depart from normal constructions of the self and normal modes of resolving conflict, they still draw on the collective conscience, again, a properly functionalist term, collective conscience, by tapping into the deep reservoir of moral practice and belief available in popular religion. So where Buddhism, which is a major source of Sinhala norms, would eschew revenge, stories of ghosts and possession provide Sinhala Buddhists with ways of expressing their hatred and desires for revenge and justice, while also allowing, as he says, the preservation of their memories in socially and ritually accepted fashion. So that this is still, in a sense, an appeal to the ordinary or the everyday without really being an appeal to norms. That is, then, they provide socially recognizable ways to express forbidden thoughts and feelings. Now, we might also take this observation to reflect on how the resources to critique the actual everyday, in Das's formulation, lie within the everyday. They differ from norms and do not draw on or aspire to the normal. So that we can see then that the normal and the ordinary are doing different sorts of conceptual and analytical work here. Perera argues that the local methods of healing and coping, spirit possession, ghost stories, and so forth, he described operate not just on the level of the individual, but at the community level too. So in large part, this is because the rituals and ceremonies of popular religion that individuals would enact are both socially common, they're shared socially, and are social in their practice. Rituals involve multiple people, or they can. He concludes with the following summary. I would locate these particular ghost stories, experiences of spirit possession, invocations to gods, and other methods of popular religious coping as interventions in a single functional category. When confidence in secular systems of coping, healing, and compensation are unavailable or have failed, it should not be surprising that people resort to traditional and more accessible mechanisms. These are then the ways that a community can remember its dead and disappeared members and put its collective losses and violent past into a perspective that allows its members to go on. You could say go on in the scene of devastation, giving expression to the forbidden ways that will to the forbidden, so desires for revenge, for example, in ways that will not wrench the community apart further as actual direct pursuit of revenge would, while allowing individuals to meet their obligations to the dead. So that's it for this piece. Thank you.